We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Nazir. This is Nazir Daf 53a. And the previous Amud, Rami Bar Chama asked, let's say you have a quarter of a kav of bones. This is talking about broken bones that come from the shedra and the gilgolis, from the spine and the skull. So we know that creates tumas ohel. The question is, does the Nazir have to shave on that amount of bones as well? And the reason why that is a question is because let's say you have a quarter of a kav of bones, again, broken bones that come from other evarim, what we call rov binyano and rov binyano, the majority of the structure, bones that form the majority of the structure of the body, or rov binyano, the majority of the number of the bones of the body, and you have a quarter of a kav, so that does create tumas ohel, but it's not enough that the Nazir has to shave. According to the Mishnah, it has to be a chatzi kav, a half a kav of bones in order for the Nazir to shave. And so the question is, maybe the shedra and the gilgolis, if the bones come specifically from there, so maybe it's not a rova, maybe even a rova atzamas, even if it's just a quarter of a kav of bones, maybe that's enough that the Nazir has to shave. And so the Gemara tried to bring a proof from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah mentions the shedra and the gilgolis, and that's talking about the shedra and the gilgolis when they're intact. But the Gemara said if it was true even a quarter of a kav, if there was this chumrah, so it should have said that in the Mishnah. Why didn't it say that? And so the Gemara now says that's not necessarily a proof, because v'haravahu da'ama, Rava himself, he's the one that said, lo nitzrucha ela l'shedra v'gilgolas she'ein bohen rova atzamas, that the Mishnah is needed specifically for a case, let's say you have a very small body, and the spine and the skull, they don't even add up to a quarter of a kav of bones, so therefore you can't really deduce anything if you had a quarter of a kav of bones from the spine and the skull, if the case in the Mishnah is talking about when the shedra and the gilgolis aren't even a quarter of a kav. The Rashi over here explains, "V'aravahu da'amar la'el hadakatani min hames." So it said in the Mishnah also from the body of it said from the body, from the dead body. So lo nitzracha. So the question over there earlier in the Gemara was, why does it have to say a mace if we already have kezayis min hames? So what do you have to say the mace for? And so one of the answers to that question earlier was Rava said, lo nitzracha ela l'rov binyano l'rov binyano. He said when we talk about the dead body, we're talking about just the skeleton, not with flesh. And we're talking about where, again, you have the majority of the structure of the bones, the majority of the number of the bones. That's the tum we're talking about. And he specifically said that the point is, even if it's a very small body and you don't have a quarter of a kav of bones, that's what the chiddush of the Mishnah is, that since you have the entire structure of the skeleton, or the majority of the structure of the skeleton, so that's enough to create this tumas ohel. That's how Rav explained the Mishnah when it was talking about the mace. Again, like we said, even though there's no flesh, that's how Rava understood that line in the Mishnah of min hames. Still, it creates tumas ohel, and also shehanazir megaleach olav. Also, the Nazir has to shave on it. And so the Gemara now is assuming that what Rava said would apply to shedra and gilgolis in the Mishnah as well. V'uadin l'shedra v'gilgolis. The same thing is true by the spine and the skull. She'ein bahen rova atzamas. We're talking about a small body. It doesn't have a quarter of a kav of bones. Ta'achashivi kiyadadi. The point is, since it's intact, it's considered to be chashuv. It's considered to be important, and therefore there's tumas ohel in that case, and therefore the Nazir shaves. But in any case, if you're going to understand that's what the Mishnah meant by shedra and gilgolis, so you don't really have any proof anymore about rova atzamas. Al makol shagain desvir leila Rava. You could actually say on the contrary. Certainly Rava might hold the heicha deiko rova atzamas, that if you have a quarter of a kav of bones, mishedra v'gilgolis, from the spine and the skull, the Nazir megaleach olav, that the Nazir would shave. In other words, it very well could be, even though the Mishnah didn't mention it, it very well could be that the Mishnah is talking about a very small shedra and gilgolis. That's why the Mishnah doesn't mention anything about a quarter of a kav coming from the shedra v'gilgolis. But it very well could be that if you have a quarter kav of bones, broken bones coming from the shedra and gilgolis, you don't need a half a kav for the Nazir to shave. Just like the quarter kav of bones is enough to create tumas ohel, as it says in Ahalos, it's also going to be enough that the Nazir has to shave. And the Gemara continues and says, so Basar Deshama Rabbi Akiva. So the question again was, why is Rava bringing a proof from the Mishnah if it was Rava himself who said the Mishnah is not relevant, because the Mishnah is talking about a very small spine and skull that doesn't even have a quarter kav of bones? And the Gemara answers, and this answer is discussed, the text of the Gemara also is discussed by the Rishonim, but the Gemara says that was after he heard from Rabbi Akiva. We'll see Rashi's approach to that line. Inachinami, indeed that is true, that originally Rava held, the Rova Atzamos Gemiri, that quarter of a kav of bones, that's true, that's going to create this tumas ohel, and the Nazir has to shave. Elabazar the Shama Rabbi Akiva. But after he heard from Rabbi Akiva, the Amar Hashedra v'Hagolgoles, v'lo Amar bar Rov Atzamas, who mentioned the Shedra and the Golgoles, the spine and the skull. Now Rabbi Akiva, that was Rabbi Akiva who was mentioned earlier. Rabbi Akiva said a number of items where if they come from a combination of two bodies, that can also create the Tumah. And so one of them was Shedra and Golgoles. And Rabbi Akiva over there didn't mention a quarter kav of bones. The Havamina Rabbi Akiva, so you would have thought, according to Rabbi Akiva, the Afal Gav, the Mishnei Mesim Boim, Isbu Tumah, that even though it comes from two different bodies, it's going to be Tameh. Well, the Rabbanon Ada'asi Mimesech, and according to the Rabbanon, it all has to come from one body. That was the Machlokas Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon that we had earlier. Umidelo Tani Hachi, now from the fact that it doesn't say over there anything about Rova Atzamos and that Machlokas, Rabbi Akiva and the Rabbanon, Shma Mina Delakuli Alma Chatzi Kav Atzamos Be'in, and you see that according to everyone, it really needs to be a half a kav in order for the Nazir to shave. Bein B'shar Atzamos, Bein Barov Binyano V'rov Minyano, Bein B'shedra V'Golgoles. Whether we're talking about other bones, whether we're talking about bones that come from the majority of the structure of the body or from the majority of the number of bones of the body, and whether it's the spine and the skull, once it was clear from Rabbi Akiva that was the case, so again, Rava said, once it was clear from Rabbi Akiva, he didn't mention a quarter kav of bones, it must be that you need a chatzi kav of atzamos. And so the point, according to Rashi, is that when Rava made this comment of Lo nitzrucha el l'shedra v'golgolas she'ein ben rova atzamas, and that statement implied that if you would have a quarter of a kav of bones from the shedra and the golgolas, the Nazir does in fact have to shave. That was before he saw Rabbi Akiva in the Brisa. But again, after Rava saw Rabbi Akiva in the Brisa, so it was clear that rova atzamas, the Nazir would not shave on that. It's only on a chatzi kav atzamas, it's only on a half a kav of atzamas that the Nazir shaves. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof, and this is from the Brisa we quoted on the previous Amud. Shammai Omer, Shammai says, Etzem echad min shedra o min golgoles, one bone from the spine or from the skull. Rashi explains, Tashma Shammai Omer Rova Atzamas Sha'amr. We're talking about the quarter kav of bones. Afilu bizman sheba me'etzem echad o mishedra o migolgoles. Shammai's point was, even if it comes from just one bone, that's enough to create the tumasoel. It can come from either the spine or from the skull. Alma deverova sag. You see, a quarter kav is enough. V'husha yehei mishedra v'golgoles, and that's if it comes from the spine or the skull. And again, that assumes over here that's not only for Tumas Oel, but it's also going to be enough for the Nazir to shave. But the Gemara says, no, Shani Shammai, the Machmir Tzvei. You can't bring a proof from Shammai. Shammai is different because he's more Machmir than the Rabbanan. So the Gemara says, let's go the other direction. Livshot Mina. So then we should conclude from here, Taima de Shammai de Machmir, that this is only Shammai's opinion, he's strict. Hal Rabbanan Adika Chatzi Kavat Samos. And maybe the Rabbanan are saying on the contrary, you need to have a half a kav of bone, even from the Shedr or the Golgolas. You need a half a kav in order for the Nazir to shave. But the Gemara says you don't know that. Either Dilma Adkan Lo Pligi Rabbanan led the Shammai, Ela Betzem Echad. It could be the Rabbanan are only arguing the Shammai in terms of whether coming from one bone is enough, or it has to come from Rov Binyano, Avo Berova Atzamas. But let's say it's a quarter kav of bones in terms of that issue. Afilu Rabbanan Modu. It could very well be that even the Rabbanan agree. So you have no proof from this Brisa. So the Gemara still has no proof one way or the other in terms of this question. If the Rova Atzamas are coming from the Shedra and the Gilgolas, so is that going to be enough for the Nazir to have to shave or not? And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, Zikainim harishonim, when it came to the earlier elders, Miksasan hayuomrim, some of them said as follows, Chatzi kav atzamos, that when it comes to a half a kav of bones, v'chatzi lugdam, or a half a lug of blood, lakol, that is the amount that is needed for everything, meaning to say it always needs to be a half a kav of bones, it always has to be a half a lug of blood, and that applies for all halachas, whether we're talking about for Tumas Ohel, whether we're talking about for a Nazir shaving, it always has to be a half. And Rova Atzamos or Revias Dam, a quarter of a kav of bones or a quarter of a lug of blood, lo lakol, that does not apply to anything. Meaning, these Zakanim Harishonim disagreed with our Mishnah, because our Mishnah makes a distinction. Our Mishnah says that it's a quarter kav of bones and a Revias Halug, a quarter of a lug of blood in order to create Tumas Ohel, but it's a Chatzi kav and it's a Chatzi lug in order for the Nazir to have to shave. But the original Zakanim didn't say that. They made no distinction. They said it's always going to be a half a kav, always going to be a half a lug. Now, some of the earlier Zakanim, they said like this, Af Rova Atzamos or Revias Dam lakol, that actually, no, it's the other way around. It's a quarter kav of bones or a quarter of a lug of blood. That's the halacha. That's the amount for everything. And that's enough to make the Nazir shave, just like it's enough for Tumas Ohel. But that was all the original teaching of the Zakanim. But Bezdin Shalach Areim, but the later court came along and they said like our Mishnah. Amru, they said, Chatzi kav atzamas v'chatzi lag dam lakol. it's a half a kav of bones, half a lug of dam, that's for all kinds of tumas. But rova atzamos or revius dam, but let's say you only have a quarter kav of bone, or you only have a quarter of a lug of blood, so that's enough to make tumah l'truma v'kachim. That's enough to make tumah in terms of isurim that have to do with truma and kachim. Avalol and nazir vosa pesach, but that's not enough that a nazir would have to shave, and it's not enough tumah to say that, let's say, somebody cannot bring the carbon pesach. Rashi explains, Amar Rabbi Eliezer, Zakenim Harishon Miksason Hayu Omrim, Chatzi Kavat Samas V'Chatzi Lug Dam Lakol Mitame Ba'oel, talking about Tumas Oel, it's got to be a half. Bein l'truma v'kachim, bein l'nazir v'yosa pesach. And they said it applies to everything, it always has to be a half. And the other Zakenim said, this is still the first Zakenim, Rovo Revias Dam Lola Kol Mitame, Kolomar Afilu Echon Mikula Meinu Mitame. Those first Miksas Zakenim Harishonim said that when it comes to a quarter, if it's a quarter kav, if it's a quarter of a lug of blood, that's not going to have any halachic ramifications. Umiksas and Hayom. Now some of the early Zakenim said Afrovat Samos Revias Dam Mitame Misakol. No, it's the other way around. The quarter kav, the quarter lug, that's Mitame for everything. But then came along the later Bezin, Bezin Shalacharei and Omrim, Chatzi Kav, again, Chatzi Kav, obviously it generates Tumah for everything. Aval Rovat Samos Revias Dam, but let's say it's just a quarter of a Kav, or it's just a quarter of a lug of blood, Linyan Achilas, Truma V'Kachim, Etam and Boel. So if there's Tumah Sohel, that will create Tumah Sohel, and the person can't have Truma and Kachim. Aval Lo Lister you may Nazir, but that's not going to undo the count of the days of Nazirus. The Nazir won't have to shave. V'Yosa Pesach, or let's say somebody wants to bring the carbon Pesach, that's also okay. Letame Shalola Asosa, Devamakum Kares, Lo Hamidu Divreim. When it comes to, let's say, carbon Pesach, which is an issue of Kares, so Lo Hamidu Divreim, the Rabbanan weren't so strict in such a situation. We're not going to be strict in those cases. That's what the Bezin Shalachareim said. Again, they made this distinction, and they said it's a Chatzi Kav, Chatzi Lug, that's for all halachas, but when it comes to the quarter Kav, when it comes to the quarter Lug, that's only for Trum and Kachim and not for Nazir and carbon Pesach. And the Gemara continues, Michdi, let us see, Ein hachras shlishis machras, this kind of third opinion, middle compromise opinion, that's not something we should necessarily follow. Rashi explains, Michdi ein hachras shlishis machras, Michdi, kol hachras shiva mixas, if you have a hachra that's just like a partial middle of the road opinion, b'mixas kedivrei zeh, or mixas kedivrei zeh, meaning it follows a little bit one side, a little bit the other side, ein hachra, that's not called a hachra that you have to paskin like. Ad shetei kula kedivrei echon mehan da hachra loshon, shikol sheshokel divrei shnayim yoser me'echad. A hachra means that you have two earlier opinions, and then the later opinion comes along and determines who to follow. In such a situation, we would follow the later opinion. But over here, if you have a later opinion that's taking a little bit from this side and a little bit from that side, Umaro Rabbi Eliezer lomar kach bezin shalacharein kach hayomer. Why did Rabbi Eliezer say the later bezin is like this? Or you could also say, why did the Mishnah follow that later bezin? There's no reason to follow it if it's like a middle opinion and not really deciding, not really paskening based on two earlier opinions. And so the Gemara answers, Amar Rabbi Yaakov Baridi, Rabbi Yaakov Baridi says, Mipi Shmuel Amru, it was from a tradition that they said, Mipi Chagai Zechariah Malachi. It comes from Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Rashi over here says, Amar Rabbi Yaakov Baridi, Lomar She'ikarhu Shehu Mipi Shmaya V'Avtalyan. This was an early tradition, V'Istamri Shomru Mipi Chagai Zechariah Malachi. Some have from Chagai Zechariah Malachi. In other words, the point is, the real reason we're following this Bezin Shalachareim is because we have a tradition that goes back all the way to Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Al Elu HaNazir Megaleach, on all of these the Nazir shaves. It was talking about all these different kinds of tumos that create Tumah Sohel. And the Gemara says, Al Elu Dereisha. When it says Al Elu in the beginning of the Mishnah, it says it twice. So that's Lemu'ute Etzem Kisaora. That comes to exclude, let's say you have a bone the size of a barley. So there's no Tumah Sohel. Dal Mago V'al Maso in. There is going to be Tumah if you touch it or if you carry it. V'alohilolo. But in terms of Tumah Sohel, that doesn't apply. V'al Elu the Seifa and the Al Elu at the end of the Mishnah, Lemu'ute Even HaSechuchis. That comes to exclude Even HaSechuchis. Even HaSechuchis is a case that's mentioned in the later Mishnah coming up. Rashi here says, Lemu'ute Even HaSechuchis, Even Mesame V'zui Even Shemutelis Al Gabi HaMeis B'Rishos HaRabim. The way Rashi understands, we're talking about a stone that's hanging over a mace in Rishos HaRabim. Kidim Mefarish B'Meseches Shabbos B'Perek Amar Rabbi Akiva, Shem HaNazir Yoshev Oleh. Let's say the Nazir sits upon it. Aval Pi Shemetamos, so even though it creates Tumah, Einu Megaleach Oleh. There's no shaving for that kind of Tumah. Lashon acher, another explanation, Rashi says, Even haschuches, even hamisacheches ala kever. It means a stone that creates an overhang over a grave. The kaimul on kalam metaltalin mevian asatuma, because generally speaking, that would create tumah. There would be a tumas ohel over there. But over hamardea chutz mi klei glolim uklei avonim uklei adama. But that's not true when it comes to klei avonim, something that comes from stone. So that's a second explanation of Rashi. The Gemara later on that Mishnah that talks about this will explain what Even haschuches is. We'll deal with that as well. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah says, v'chatzi kav atzamos, a half a kav of bones. That causes that a Nazir has to shave, as we said, a quarter of a kav of bones. Even though it creates tumaso, the Nazir doesn't have to shave on that. It's only a half a kav. We will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Beis.